Welcome to the Relational Grace Podcast, where we share the teachings of Pastor Nick Harris, who taught us that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I'm your host, Jamie Russell, Pastor Harris's son. We continue to follow the life of David in our current series. In this episode, we'll touch on the topic of vengeance. The need for vengeance is as old as human nature. Vengeance can be overwhelming. Let's listen to Pastor Harris as he walks us through how David handles vengeance against King Saul. And in the end, Pastor Harris will provide us 3 things regarding vengeance that will help us understand it and in turn deal with it. So let's hear what Pastor Harris has to say in this 4th episode of the Saga of David series titled Getting Vengeance.
I want to begin this morning by making an observation. And that observation is this. As I see it, the need to seek revenge when someone has done us wrong, the need to get even, is one of the basic components of human nature. Now, this need has been outlined in some of the greatest literature ever written. One of my favorites being Alexander Dumas's The Count of Monte Cristo. There is a classic example of someone who gave their entire life to the quest for revenge. And if you know the story, you know the outcome of that quest. It's never pretty. But it was William Shakespeare who wrote what I consider to be the defining classic on the subject of revenge. It's entitled Othello, the Moor of Venice. Remember? Here, Shakespeare painted a picture in words of what it means to avenge oneself. Now, the central character is this man Othello, a Moorish general in the service of the Doge of Venice. Now, the central character then is Othello, and serving with him is an ambitious, cunning man whose name was Iago. And when an opening arose for an aide-de-camp for Othello, he promoted a young man whose name was Cassio instead of promoting Iago. Now, Iago felt slighted, and he vowed that some way or another he was going to get even with Othello. And within days, Iago launched a plot to get even with the general for having slighted him. And his plan of action was both diabolical and ingenious. You see, over time, Iago had studied Othello closely. And he was more than well aware of Othello's one overriding, single greatest weakness. It was his all-consuming love of his beautiful wife, Desdemona. And this was the place where Iago chose to attack Othello. What he did was this. He slowly but surely began to sow seeds of doubt and distrust in the mind of Othello. And soon, jealousy began to germinate and take root in the mind of this man. And finally, Iago came, after this had developed to a certain place, Iago was watching him closely and studying him, and when he saw that it had taken root, he came to Othello pretending to be a concerned friend and accused Cassio and Desdemona of being lovers. And the jealous Othello listened to the lie. And this emotion of jealousy, once it had taken root, continued to grow, being fed all the time by Iago until it began to consume Othello. Of course, Desdemona was innocent of any involvement whatsoever with Cassio. She deeply loved and adored and respected her husband. But one night in a jealous rage, Othello confronted Desdemona with his doubts. Of course, she denied his accusations. But at some point, the mind of Othello snapped, and he leaped on the defenseless Desdemona and suffocated her to death. The cunning Iago had exacted his revenge. Othello had slighted him. Othello had wounded his pride, but he had gotten even. However, within days of committing this act, Iago's scheme was revealed. He was arrested and put into prison. Life didn't turn out to be so good for Iago. He had gotten his revenge, but he hadn't gotten his victory. Which brings us to the saga of David ben Jesse. Now let me assure you, this man David ben Jesse was a different kind of man than Iago. If any man ever had the right to seek revenge, it was David ben Jesse. Saul had wrongly treated him. He had treated him grievously. And remember, this man had reduced David from the commander of Israel's army to being a common outlaw. Saul had taken his wife from him, his home from him, and his reputation from him. So if David had chosen to get even with Saul, most of us would have applauded David. We'd have said, David, you had every right. If he'd have come to me for counseling, I'd said, David, you did the right thing. Hello? He could have done it. He had the right. He could have devoted himself to giving the king a taste of his own medicine. David could have tormented Saul just like Iago had tormented Othello. But David was a better man than Iago. In fact, he was a better man than me. How so? Well, I've always wanted to get even with the Sauls in my life. And I've gotten even with a few of them. How about you? How about you? Maybe your husband or your wife left you. Maybe you were terminated from a job for no reason. Maybe someone took advantage of you in a business deal. Maybe someone lied about you, and in so doing, ruined your reputation. My tendency here is to always fight back. That's my first emotion. I want to fight back. I want to get even. Now, some of you younger people may not understand the term vengeance. I realize we don't call this desire to get even vengeance anymore, do we? We have several new and more politically correct words for this emotion. You know, we call it getting even. But what we often say about getting even, we say, I'll get even if it's the last thing I do. We say, I've been wrong, and I've got to stand up for myself. But beloved, it doesn't matter how we say it. God calls this need for retaliation vengeance, and He makes His feelings about it crystal clear. Listen to what the Apostle Paul writes to us in Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 19. He says, repay no one evil for evil. He's not stuttering here. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. In other words, look for the good in them. Everybody's got a bunch of evil. Why don't you hunt the good, he says, if it's possible, as much as it depends on you. Live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourself, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. Listen, God is your defender. God is going to take care of you. And what I'm saying is this, our efforts to avenge ourselves are always contrary to God's highest and best for us. As long as we're seeking to get even, we're not living at the place where God is telling us to live. God's got an ideal for us, and when we are seeking vengeance, we're living way beneath what God has for us. And remember this, Paul says vengeance belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. Now let me tell you how vengeance works. I know I'm an expert at it. We begin to look for some area where the one who wronged us is weak. Just like Iago did. Now, Iago knew that Othello had a tendency to be jealous. This was his weak spot. So when Iago attacked Othello, he attacked him at the point of the lack of trust that he had in his heart for his wife Desdemona. He thought she was too good for him. He looked at her and saw this beautiful woman and thought he didn't deserve it because he was a Moor. And in the end, Iago got his satisfaction. He was able to wound Othello more deeply than Othello had wounded him. You see, that desire is expressed in the Old Testament as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But you know what? If we give in to that ethic, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, eventually the whole world's going to be blind and toothless. It's just not a good way to behave yourself. That's the pattern of vengeance. We feel injured, so we find a vulnerable spot in the one who inflicted the injury. And then we go out and wound this person. Only we attempt to wound this person more seriously. See, it's escalating. All the while, that vengeance escalates. We do it to make us feel better. But here's the sad truth. After we've exacted vengeance, we never feel any better. Never. Find me someone who says they feel better about it. You remember several years ago, it's probably been 20 years maybe, not several, but 20. There was a father, this man had murdered his son, had brutalized this little boy in every conceivable way. They took him to trial, and as they let him out of the courtroom, this guy was talking, acting like he was talking on the telephone, reached his pants, pulled out a pistol, and blew this guy's brains out. Well, that guy has spent the rest of his life in prison. You see, the outcome is never good. We think we'll feel better, but we don't. Now, as I said earlier, if a man ever had reason to seek vengeance, it was David ben Jesse. From a strictly human perspective, he would have been justified in anything he chose to do with Saul. And the situation became increasingly worse. See, what Saul had done is that when David left the cave at Adullam, which I talked about last week, Saul got on his trail and chased him into the deserts of Judea, into a place called the wilderness of Maon. Now, he had David trapped. David was about to die. I mean, this was a situation of 6,000 on 600. And there was no hope for David in this thing. And suddenly, guess what happens? God acts, of course, the skeptic would say it's just coincidental, but a raiding party of Philistines, several thousand Philistines, just happens to show up at that time. Saul spots them, knows he's got to take care of that problem, so leaves David, and he goes and drives away the Philistine raiders. Now, it was this Philistine diversion that actually saved the life of the future king of Israel. In other words, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a God incident. But soon thereafter, David got his opportunity to exact revenge on Saul. Now, here's what happened. Once Saul had turned aside to fight the Philistines, David and his men fled from the wilderness of Maon, and they quickly made their way to the oasis of En-Gedi on the shores of the Dead Sea. And I've asked Fred if he would put up some pictures this morning of En-Gedi, because it is quite a place. Look here. I want you to notice something. Look at the caves. I mean, the place is filled with caves. As you enter into this wadi, notice this high mountain. This high mountain, if you stand on the top of it, you can see Jerusalem clearly. Jerusalem is about 8 miles away. And there's this deep, deep wadi that runs through here. Notice this cave right here. It's going to become very important in just a moment. Now, there's Michael, yes. Now, why would David flee to this place? There's something there more valuable than gold. Water. Look at this waterfall. Coming down from a natural spring. Whoops. Coming down from a natural spring that was up at the top of the mountain. And you can see it as it flows down here. It comes down, makes its way down this wadi, and comes here and cools. And so, what would you need in a desert? Water. David goes where there's water. Now, if you look here, here's some of the caves. They go back into the hills. More of the beautiful waterfalls at En-Gedi. I mean, it is an oasis in the middle of a wilderness. It is something really extra special. Now, in the caves that I showed you above the oasis, David found temporary refuge. But the tenacious Saul did not give up. In fact, listen to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Now it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, that it was told to him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. Now that rock I showed you a moment ago is the rock of the wild goats. We know that without a question. That's always been the place where it was. Now, did you notice that Saul has 3,000 men with him? 3,000. Now, you talk about an uneven fight. This was it. The odds were 5-1. 3,000 against 600. Now, I point this out to demonstrate to you that Saul meant business. He meant to kill David. He wasn't going to arrest him. He was going to kill him. Now, when he and his warriors reached En-Gedi, Saul spotted a cave, the one I showed you just a moment ago, And so he climbed up to that level and entered into the mouth of the cave so that he could take a nap. He had been riding all day long. At this time, he's a rather aged guy for that era. He was probably becoming 60 years old, which was very old at the time. And now he slipped into that cave and he laid down, laid his pallet out, and immediately went to sleep. Little did he know that David and his mighty men, those 600, were hiding behind every rock and every ledge in that cave that day. Now, where is the ball? The ball is in David's court. Saul, the tormentor, was now in the hands of David ben Jesse. David could have killed Saul then and there. Now, it is at this point in the text where the human need to get even switches into overdrive. I love what David's men did when David didn't kill Saul immediately. They expected he would grab the sword of Goliath, slip over, and chop his head off. That's what they were looking for. You see, they wanted Saul to die. They wanted vengeance against this man. And they wanted it for several reasons. Number one, they'd been driven away from their homes just as David had his. Their wives and children were in jeopardy just like David's were. But most of all, they wanted to kill Saul because of what he had done to the innocent priests at Nob. He had killed all 85 of those holy men. But now, I have to admit, David's mighty men were subtle. What they did was this. They cloaked their need for vengeance in religious wrappings, just like we do. Listen to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 4a. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day of which the Lord said to you." Now, who are they turning to? David, this is the day that God said. Boy, you know what? A lot of people will tell you what God said. And what they'll do is they'll take what God said and twist it around and turn it and have you doing all kinds of things that are contrary to the will of God. So this is the day of which the Lord said to you, "Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." See, God's given you permission, David, just to eat this. Kill this sucker. We'll be through with all of this we've been going through if you'll just kill him. Now, do you see what's happening here? These men were hiding their fleshly desire to get even by telling David that they would be doing God's work. He would be doing it if he would just kill Saul. That insane king deserved to die. He was a menace to society. Kill that guy. They tried to convince David that God himself had placed Saul in this vulnerable position. It's God that brought him here for you to kill, so that David could kill him and take the throne of Israel that was rightly his. But the coup de grace was this. After everything that Saul had done to him, David had the right to get even, didn't he? That's the way we think. Looking for what that man did to that man. He has the right to get even. Beloved, do you see what's happening here? What these mighty men were doing was nothing less than rationalizing their need for vengeance. And yet I see this happening every day among Christian people, including the pastor of Ariel Chapel, that dirty rat. We tend to cloak the most evil acts and attitudes in religious language. But it's wrong, my friends. It's wrong. God doesn't like it. And David didn't either. Remember now, David was a man after God's own heart. What does that mean? It means that the things that mattered to God mattered to him. So he refused to listen to his men, no matter how godly they may have sounded. He had a relationship with God, and he knew about God. He knew what kind of personality his God was. But I must say this. David did not let this opportunity pass without exacting just a little teeny tiny bit of retaliation. As a matter of fact, listen to 1 Samuel 24:4 again. Down the last sentences. And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Just a little teeny bit of cloth. He cuts it off of the robe of the king. Now here's what fascinates me. David had not even gotten his knife back in the sheath before the voice of God was speaking to him. Listen to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verses 5 and 6. So David, 5 and 6. Now, it happened afterwards that David's heart troubled him. Who brought this trouble about? It's God. It's his conscience. It's the voice of the Spirit speaking to him. David's heart troubled him because he had cut off Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord." Do you see the dynamic? Since David was a man after God's own heart, he was sensitive to even the smallest sins, sins that you and I fail to take seriously. In fact, he felt so guilty about even touching the robe of a man that God had once anointed that he was driven to confess this thing before God and man immediately. He sensed in his heart what God would reveal to the Apostle Paul. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay," says the Lord. So 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 7 tells us what David did. So David restrained his servants with these words, and did not allow them to arise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went his own way. Now, beloved, here's the key to all this. Because David refused to exact vengeance on God's anointed, God blessed him. You see, I am of the opinion that had he killed Saul in that cave that day, that throughout David's own kingship, he would have had plot after plot after plot after plot to kill him. Because what you set in motion comes back to you sometimes 7 times. But you know, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 7 says this: "When a man's ways please the Lord, He makes even his enemies to be at peace with him." Thank you, James. That would certainly be the case here. David and his men allowed King Saul to leave the cave and return to the bottom of the wadi, where we saw the pictures taken a while ago, where his men awaited him. And as they began to make their way toward the waterfalls and those great pools of water that gathered there at En-Gedi, David appeared in the mouth of the cave that we just saw. That same cave, not some other cave. You understand? You were looking at the very cave, not some other cave. David appears in the mouth of the cave. He steps out. He shouts, attracts the attention of Saul and his men to himself. And then he engaged Saul in conversation. And this is one of the most enlightening conversations I think I've ever heard. David spoke first, and he opened his remarks with words of complete respect and admiration for his king. My first words would have been Jimmy Cagney. "You dirty rat." Now, he said this first in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 8. David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called to Saul, saying, you get it? "My Lord." That means you're a servant. "My Lord the King, I serve you. You hate my guts. You chase me. You're after me. But my Lord the King." I love this. I know it's right. I don't want to do it, but I know it's right. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped down with his face to the earth and bowed down. He knelt before the man who had been seeking his life. And after these respectful words, David attempted to set the record straight. Listen to his words in 1 Samuel 24:9. "And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men who say, indeed David seeks your harm? Why are you listening to that? Why have you chosen to believe a lie?" Then David added the proof of his undying fidelity to his king. He says this in 1 Samuel 24:10 and 11. He said, "Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. The oil was poured upon his head. Moreover, my father, see." Yes, he calls him his father. "Yes, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you. Know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you, yet you hunt my life to take it." Finally, David told Saul that he was willing to allow God himself to judge between the two of them. And in 1 Samuel 24:12, David says this, "Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you." You see, more than anything else in David's life, the man after God's own heart wanted the will of God to be achieved and done. He wanted this more than he wanted revenge. Now when Saul heard these words, as insane as he was, something happened to him. David's words and his actions as he looked there and saw that piece of robe, I'm sure he looked down at the bottom of his robe to see that it had been cut away. And David's holding that piece of robe in his hand. Listen to the words. David's words and actions moved the heart of the king. And in 1 Samuel 24:16 through 20, we read these words. "So it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul says, 'Is this your voice, my son David?' And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Then he said to David, 'You are more righteous than I. For you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely?' We know the answer to that. The answer is no. Therefore, may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand." Is this a beautiful story? Now you may be asking yourself, "Pastor, what does this story mean to you and me, people living 3,000 years after these events occurred?" Well, it means just this. The need for vengeance is as old as human nature. But when we allow ourselves to give in to vengeance and to retaliate against those persons we consider to be our enemies, it makes a mockery of God's control over our lives. We're saying, "God, I don't believe that you're big enough to handle this situation. I have got to take a hold of it myself." Beloved, we have to let these feelings go. There's a time in life when I would let those feelings overwhelm me. And I still see it happening all the time. You know where I see it happening most times? It's in divorces. Now, in the vast majority of divorces I see, it is the husband. If you're going to allay fault, you allay it to the husband. It's usually he who finds someone half his age and runs off, has his midlife crisis or whatever. But what invariably I see happening is there's children, when there's children involved especially, is that wife becomes very bitter. And she wants vengeance. I was hurt. I want to get even. I want to do something here. And so what she does, because the husband's got the power, what she does is she begins to poison the children. She begins to paint pictures for the children. Here's the problem with that. When children get to be teenagers, they begin to look at that parent and they don't see that parent the same way that that embittered person has depicted them. And they begin to look at the accuser and say, "You poisoned me." And then all of that vengeance is turned against them by the children. It would have been so much better. And most people who've been in this place, believe me, I have been. And most people who've been in this place know that I'm telling the truth. There was a time in my life when I wouldn't let these feelings go. Feelings to get even. See if you can relate to this. Somebody do me wrong, I'd go to bed at night, and then the tapes would begin to play. Huh? I hear laughter. The rest of you have tapes. And the tapes would begin to play, and I would begin to concoct plots. I'm going to say this, and that person's going to say this, and then when that person says this, then I'm going to say that, and then when I say that, then I'm going to that person, and then yes, and you do not sleep at night, you roll and toss. I scheme, develop, get even plans. Roll and toss. But you know what? I never enacted any of those. I thought about them a lot, but I never did anything about them. And I was better for never having done anything about it. Now here's 3 things I know about life in this world. Now let me give you 3 things I know. I don't know a whole lot, but this much I do know. First place, human sin and depravity makes mistreatment in this life an inevitability. I'm here to warn you, it's going to happen. The sin in this world is going to make it certain that bad things happen to good people. The same sin nature that lurked in the mind of Saul ben Kish lurks in the minds of all of us. And remember, that sin nature will be released toward others. And when that happens, it's never pleasant. I hate it. I hate it when somebody releases their fleshly nature against me. But it's going to happen. You might as well get ready for it. Number 2, we will always feel the need for vengeance while we live in this sin-sick, disturbed, fallen world. And since this is the case, we have to keep our guard up. We have to recognize what it is when it raises its ugly head. Because vengeance is ugly. We must not allow ourselves to lash out. In other words, we must use our will and not our emotions. Most of us let go and do stupid things because we give in to our emotions. We've got to depend upon the will. We say, I will not do that. What's the word? Will. I will not do that. Then thirdly, we must refuse to fight others using the arm of the flesh. In other words, we mustn't allow ourselves to strike out. That's simply to say, we must not act on our feelings. When we're trusting God, what do? We surrender our feelings to Him. Now, the Apostle Paul gives us the answer on how we deal with those who despitefully use us, those who hurt and grieve us. Listen again to his words in Romans 12:17 through 21. Now listen carefully. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. Look for the best in people. Is that so hard, just to look for the best in people? If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Now, I know this is not easy to do. I know. I often fail to do it myself. Hello? Are you listening? I often give into it myself. You're a pastor, yes. Why? Because I'm a sinner. But it is God's way of dealing. It's God's way of dealing. See, God's way is constructive. It's never destructive. Our way is destructive, rarely constructive. So don't let our feelings devour us. Don't use our hand to strike. That's really what Jesus was trying to say when He told us to turn the other cheek. He's not talking about letting someone come up and brutalize you, and you never defend yourself. He's talking about the fact that he's trying to get it clear to us that we never gain anything by striking back. Paul said, live peaceably as much as possible. Now, you're going to have a contrary neighbor once in a while, or a contrary child, or a contrary boss. You're going to say, if I could get you alone in an alley, I would kill you. The emotions go there. If you think your emotions are never going there, you got another thing coming. But we do not will to act as best as we can. We try to look for the best in others. And I found that when I look for the best in someone else, I can find some very positive things. And that's my teaching for today.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Don't forget to connect with Ariel Ministries on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to our email list at arielministries.com. That's Ariel spelled A-R-I-E-L. We look forward to keeping you updated on upcoming episodes and projects. If you would like to support the missional efforts of Ariel Ministries in Tharaka, Kenya with Each One Feed One, we'd like to remind you that 10% of all donations to Ariel Ministries will support this missional effort. Visit arielministries.com/give for online donations and other methods of giving. To learn more about the Tharaka mission, you can visit arielministries.com/missions. You can also listen to episode 26 for a deeper dive into how our relationship with Each One Feed One and the McCarter family started over 35 years ago, where we are today, and where we're headed in the future.